Thank you for inviting me to talk. I'm an architect by training, who happens to be fascinated by new neighbourhood design, and it's from that background that I just wanted to talk today. I can't forward the slide. Oh, there we go. So the award that we got a few days ago, the end of last week, was actually, it meant quite a bit to us, and I think it's quite relevant to today's talk. It was the Buildings That Stand the Test of Time Awards, and it's the inaugural awards by Architecture Today. And I've just put the citation from the judges there on the screen. And it's that a much loved sustainable neighbourhood. And that got me thinking about what it is we do to actually make people really appreciate the communities that they live in, and how they feel that there is a strong identity and a sense of belonging. And a lot of that research has that went into that particular project, which I'm going to talk about in a little while. It's Abode at Great Kneighton, is embodied in some of these documents that we publish as a studio over the last few years, exploring a lot of the things I want to talk about today. And those can all be accessed on the Proctor Matthews website there. So as a starting point, I think it was useful to sort of go back to these two quotes. One from Gordon Cullen in 74, that he wrote as part of a study for a new settlement to the south of Aberdeen called Maryculter. And he said there that people live in houses, but where do houses live? If they are homeless, then all we are left with is the typical endless, featureless suburbia. And that sort of it was a few years later to Orwell, who was saying basically the same things, that he equated the idea of suburban growth as the spread of gravy across a tablecloth. And so what I'm going to show you today are a series of studies which look at that idea of how do you create identity, local identity, character and distinctiveness. These are drawings by Cullen, who in his study of Maryculter made reference to the, hopefully I can point, yeah, made reference to the Cale Yards of the Scottish Highland landscape, this exposed landscape, and the Cale Yards being the way of protecting crops. And his thoughts were that, you know, if crops could be protected in this way, there should be a sense of enclosure and a sense of shelter given to housing. So this diagram at the top of those slides, that group of slides, shows this idea of clusters of housing sitting on the edge of a landscape but enclosed, and the bottom left is a little closer iteration of one of those clusters of homes, and these beautiful drawings here of the framework for Maryculter. And I suppose that leads on this idea of security and enclosure and safety. It leads on to this idea of the boundaries of settlements. And to us, boundaries of settlements are one of the key ways in which we can define identity. And that doesn't necessarily mean separate settlements sitting in open green fields. It could also be the idea of different quarters within a city, how you cross a threshold, a boundary into a new quarter, so that identity is expressed in that way. And this quote from Hisham Matar, the Pulitzer Prize-winning author, is about Siena, is really important, I think. This idea that walls aren't just protective, they actually help us to define what we are ourselves. They define a territory. And that to us leads on to this idea that edges, boundaries, and thresholds are probably one of the first narratives that we always investigate when we're trying to create new neighbourhoods. So I wanted to start by talking about a project we just sort of finished for Homes England in Northstowe. It's to the north of Cambridge. I think eventually this will be a new town of about 10,000 new homes. And we were looking at a settlement of about the first phase, really, of about 400, just over 450 new homes. One of the key considerations here is that, as you can see on this slide here, is that it's surrounded really by landscape on most of its sides. This is an education campus here, so this is buildings sitting in landscape, and then above on the edge here and on this northern edge. And so we started to think, well, what would it be like living in this first phase in this landscape? You know, how do you create that sense of identity? And so we started to think about other fenland settlements here, and this is really, it's not very clear, this slide, but all those settlements within those sort of field patterns were originally settlements within marshland. And the little cartoon at the bottom suggests that all those were on high gravel beds that just were above the floodplain. And so they were very clearly defined settlements. Similarly, we looked at archaeology in the area. The images on the right-hand side of that slide are actually of the archaeological investigations across the whole of the Northstowe landscape. And there were various sort of these strong forms, these defined ditches, which went back really to Bronze Age settlements and enclosures. And that started to get us thinking more about defined settlements within fenlands or within a sort of marshland landscape. And so there are a lot of the historic plans there of the Low Countries and those defined settlements, defensive in this case, but settlements sitting within a wider landscape. And the cartoon on the right was the beginning of our suggestion that maybe our proposal for Northstowe should be a defined edge, something with a very strong edge, where you step into the realm of the neighbourhood and step out into this wild landscape. And a few more diagrams there of how that strong edge maybe defines the patterns of landscape within those edges. And eventually a little cartoon. And then, of course, it became a real project. Unfortunately, it's not gone the best of ways. We built part of it, and then we had a developer that went into liquidation, I'm afraid. But so we built part of this. But the idea was that it was going to be then developed using modular housing. And so all those ideas that evolved from history can be overlaid with this sort of new technology for delivering housing quickly, or so we thought. So these are the images of those streets. But of course, it actually, to define an edge, you need to sort of think about how you're going to do that. And these are little cartoon studies of a series of edge houses. Either you sit within the settlement, these houses here, and you face into the inner world of the settlement, or the greenhouses on the edge. So you're either an introvert or an extrovert. And just to show that these were thought through in terms of their planning and how each house typology helped to create that strong defined edge. And there we have the final proposal. The next project is a more recent project. It's for an estate. It's a historic estate that was built in the 19th century by an industrialist called Corbett, and he engaged a French architect to design this little chateau for his future wife. It's in the sort of Louis XIII style, and it has a very sort of formal relationship to the sort of parterre of gardens, these raised terraces in front of the house, and then this designed landscape around it. But you can see on the right-hand side of that image, there are some buildings that have appeared in the 1970s and 80s. It's a conference centre that's now disused. And it was built on the site of a walled garden. You can just about see the footprint and these wonderful Wellingtonia trees. So our commission really was to design a small village in the grounds of the chateau. The chateau is here, and our starting point was trying to look back at the form of the walled garden in the landscape. So this part of the new neighbourhood, new village, became quite a sort of formal collection of buildings sitting within the walls of the old garden. And then the rest of the village moves off into the landscape in a different geometry. So just going back to that walled garden, so we were looking at the references to sort of French chateaux and the parterre gardens, and this idea of a structured, very formal arrangement, and these little cartoons showing how that could develop, and that developed a little bit further, a little bit more density here, but still with the idea of formal gardens sitting within this section of the new village, and a ramp that took you up through one of those sort of belvedere edges, these sort of promenades that cross the different parterres. And then this was the early drawing of the remainder of the village. So you've got the walled garden here, and then the village going off into the landscape, the railway and motorway along this edge. Bearing up, this part of the site is actually in green belt, and so it's a very sensitive planning negotiation, really, about the replacement. If we could repair the setting of the original chateau, could we actually increase the biodiversity within this part of the site by building on it? And then these are some of the drawings that went alongside the planning application. So we got planning permission for this a few months ago. So on the left, we've got the centre of the new neighbourhood, and then some of the streets leading into that central space. And they're the overall cartoon. The quality of this on this screen is really bad. I hope online it's better. So the principal idea, of course, is that where the grids twist between the formality of the walled garden and the slightly more relaxed nature of the eastern field, that we actually get the focus to the neighbourhood along an existing bridleway. There's the final plan of that. So the second narrative I wanted to talk about really was this response to landscape. And landscape is something that is often ignored, particularly in suburban developments. It's a game of numbers often. But the topography and landscape should be the drivers of narratives about anchoring a new settlement in place. And these are images from a study we did for St Albans and Decorum councils. It's for a supplementary planning guidance. We did this alongside David Locke Associates. And it was really a provocation, I suppose, to developers to say, look, that there is a form of development that is made in response to topography. And we cited various examples within the report existing examples within Hertfordshire of how topography and landscape had directly impacted on the grain and the scale and formation of the new settlements. So, and if you look at all the place names, so places end in worth or ho or ham or green, they relate to a section across a valley. So this cartoon was really to demonstrate that, and then we showed examples of where you could find this across Hertfordshire. More examples here. And then the idea was to make propositions that if we had a topography, or the developer came with a particular site that had was located somewhere along a valley section, that there was a way in which the built form could be arranged on that site, which related back to those historical forms. And so these are a series of cartoons. They're speculations again, because they're increased density, but they build on those historical settlements. This one's for the stead. And there we go. We got again a three-dimensional view of how that might be arranged. So, so the third project is another project we did with David Locke Associates. So this was for an extension, the southern expansion of Canterbury, and in a place called Mountfield Park. Again, it was designated for housing, and we got planning permission, outline planning permission for, I think it's about 4,500 new homes. But our contribution to this was to look at one particular piece in detail to demonstrate that you could actually make something, again, that was very local and of this landscape to set the scene for this future development. So the first starting point, of course, and these images are very faint, but the red ring shows the Bell Harry, the tower at Canterbury Cathedral, is viewed from the site. So as you can imagine, this is to the south of Canterbury. This is on the Pilgrims Way. So it's adjacent to a World Heritage Site, a very sensitive location. And I think that often the idea is, when you look at landscape, is that landscape is all soft and sinuous, and you know, the meandering lanes, these country lanes that meander across the landscape. But of course, the reality is this is the Kent landscape. These are hop fields and orchards and shelter belt. And it's a gridded orthogonal landscape. And when we started to look closer at our own site here, on the main Dover Road going into Canterbury from the south, you see there are these sort of vestiges of these shelter belts and orchards and hop fields. And so the proposition was that we, almost like Cullen's Mariculture study, we take that landscape model as a way of defining new settlement clusters. And so this is one of those structured clusters of homes. So instead of the conventional sort of cul-de-sac arrangement, these are clusters which are divided by productive landscapes, orchards preferably, because it's Kent, and each of the houses around the cluster have a dialogue. And we like this image because this is from an early publication of the Canterbury Tales, and of course these are all the characters in discourse around the feast, and of course our feast is the orchard in the middle, but each of the characters are the houses around the cluster. And then we looked at a little bit more detail. So we were looking at Utsson's work in Denmark, and the way in which courtyard housing is a way to define an edge of each of the clusters. more of those, the way those clusters appear, and then the final proposition. So I think what was interesting about this was it was a different way of laying out housing. I think now I was going to tell you how many houses there were 140 homes on this first phase, and the suggestion was that in clustering them this way, it actually made this idea of identity very immediate. So if the developer built this cluster first, that it would have its own identity, and the identity of this one would be different from this, would be different from this cluster, etc. Which means phasing is easier. You're not living on a building site all the time when a new neighbourhood is expanding. And but each one has its own focal space for the residents who live around it. And these are some of the drawings for that. And then finally, that orthogonal landscape of the shelter belts becomes the orthogonal landscape of these clusters, which actually align the main focal street of the new neighbourhood onto Bell Harry in the distance there. So another project that's related very much, a very different kind of project, much more sort of inner city dense project, but still related to landscape, is the work we've just been doing at Riverside, Sunderland, which we've been working alongside Kevin Murray, who's here today, and Faulkner Brown and Mawson Kerr, who are architects in Newcastle. And I think the interesting thing for us here was that the whole city of Sunderland had really turned its back in the post-industrial era away from the River Wear. So we got this amazing gorge running through the city, but everything was turning its back on this landscape. Originally, of course, it was an industrial landscape, very famous industrial landscape. Some of the early railways brought coal to drop onto barges in the coal drops along this landscape. So here we've got the idea of placing this topography, really, the centre of the city within a wider context. So it's very pivotal, this particular site on the top of this 30-metre gorge down to the River Wear. And the yellow there is this sort of change of this dramatic change of topography. And then this particular valley here is Gully's Gill, as this is called, is this landscape here, which is where the railways came down and dropped coal onto barges into the river. So one of the interesting things for us was not only were the sort of the textural qualities of the built form around the site, very distinctive. We talked about boundaries earlier. These have their own very distinct boundaries. This is the city centre. But the project was to try to encourage people to live back in the city, and to also expand the business district of the city. And so you can see here a model really of that whole landscape and the changes of level across the valley. You've got the Rio Bridge, existing bridge, very famous twin bridges, and the proposition for a new high-level bridge taking people from the centre of Sunderland to the Stadium of Light on the north side of the river, and then a low-level pedestrian bridge connecting the landscapes of the Gill here right through to the riverside walks going out to the beach. So there you can see that idea of the grain and how each neighbourhood, and I think there are 5 distinct neighbourhoods here, begin to express themselves. So picking up on that first narrative, you've got the boundaries to each one, very defined by the landscape. But I think that one of the key items of this study was really to look at the idea of silhouette and the profile of the city. And this was a fantastic opportunity to recreate what had originally been in the industrial area, this fantastic dramatic silhouette of chimneys and kilns and industrial activity. And could we put back a 21st century silhouette to the city that was worthy of this setting across the gorge? You can see that change in level, that 30-metre drop across the edge of the city. So these are various studies of those. It's terrible resolution, but these are studies of looking at a silhouette, a sawtooth silhouette, which I suppose came from this sort of architectural toy here that sits in our studio of arranging different cutouts of silhouettes so you can create new, very distinct streetscapes as you look into these slices through the different profiles. And so hopefully that's coming through on that top image with in the distance, you can see a different profile to the one on the city edge. And the first phase of that project is on the site of an old brewery, the old Vaux brewery, sits on the edge of the escarpment. And 5 minutes, okay. And one of the idea of making something distinctive is also a response to the climate. And although this is a very dramatic site, it has an amazing exposure to the elements on that exposed promontory. And so, although there are promenades along that edge, there are also these quiet community muse spaces which exist to make living on the edge a plausible proposition. I may skip through this, but this is really to do with looking at local building types and how we can translate those to meet 21st century living patterns. So we're referring to the very distinctive Sunderland yard house, the Wearside maisonette, and then peel houses, which are these sort of defensive buildings that appeared within the sort of the borders country between England and Scotland. And they make fantastic models because they're courtyards in the middle for the idea of apartment living. So some of the views of that. And that's one of those muse spaces. This is currently on site, though we're having a little bit of a problem with a contractor at the moment. And then we for the remainder of this side of the river, we did a design code, which again looked at grain here, how grain can make a distinctive neighbourhood. And then, of course, how we can create that silhouette. And then that's the overall impression. So I'll quickly go into these. So this is about settlement patterns, grain and texture. So the work we've been doing in Ireland that Hussam alluded to earlier is really about looking at a new model for medium density, low-rise family housing. They have a problem in Ireland in terms of making an affordable product that could deliver over 35 dwellings per hectare, 40 dwellings per hectare if possible, but without apartments because there's no market for apartments. And so we started to look at those traditional forms. This is a clachan, a rural cluster of homes around a communal yard or green in this particular case. And so our first proposition was that we should be designing house types which can be arranged in many different ways to create clusters of homes around communal space with private courtyard gardens. So you've got a much more greater intensity. So this is the conventional terrace model, and this is what you find all over Ireland at the moment. You've got the standard volume builder house types, parking 2 cars in the street, and you end up with a minimum of 22 metres across a street, trying to make a place with 2-storey dwellings. So the cross section across that street is just too vacuous. It's too open-ended. There's no sense of enclosure. So our proposition was that you arrange these in a different way. You get a greater density. You've got 40 dwellings per hectare here. And if you looked back there, 34 dwellings per hectare in the traditional model. But you actually get a much greater sense of spaces where people can interact with their neighbours. And I think that's about creating, again, about creating identity. And I'm sure that Stephen Willisey will talk a little bit more about this later. And so the house types begin to build a different way of assembling housing clusters. And so we're now on site with this particular project. So this is taking those same house types, but clustering them in a very different way. So this is at Wilkinsons Brook, Tyrellstown, a suburb on the edge of Dublin, and on the site of a disused golf course. So an amazing landscape to the north, and an open sort of village green to the south. So these are the house types assembled, and we start to think about a communal clachan in the heart and a public clachan in this location, connecting those two landscapes in the south. And then making reference back to a study of Irish vernacular elements, but done in a very contemporary way. The entrance is becoming very important, and as those places to meet your neighbour. I'm going to skip this one completely. Sorry about that. So I'm going to sort of finish really with this project, which is where the talk started, which is Great Kneighton. Great Kneighton is a new development of, I suppose it's over 10 years old now, on the southern fringe of Cambridge. And we were asked to do the first phase of the development of about 2,500, 2,700 new homes. Our phase was about 400, I think, 400 homes, and 460. And the starting point was really to think, well, you know, the evolution of Cambridge was a series of collegiate and monastic courts. It sort of tamed this wild fenland landscape, capturing the landscape and formalising it. And so one of the first things we did was to think about how we could tame a piece of infrastructure, which was the roundabout, taking quite heavy traffic through to Adam Brook's Medipark at the entrance to the site. And so we sort of overlaid, put the Great Court of Trinity, form of that, over that roundabout, and to see what impact that would have. So it wasn't, we weren't thinking that we'd actually be building Trinity Court. Of course, Trinity has this manicured landscape on the inside. This is a different kind of landscape, but it's about that the sort of the evolution, the Cambridge evolution of a settlement form. We're also looking at the form of fenland villages and this relationship between the landscape and the high street, and this sort of almost a sort of filigree of fingers of landscape coming into the heart of the neighbourhood, and the built form spreading out into the surrounding agricultural landscape as a series of burgage plots, these long, thin plots of yards. And that has a very distinctive impact on the townscape. So you can see that the drawing on the right there demonstrates there are a series of gables form the high street, not frontages. And that started to make us think about a way in which we could relate to an existing plantation on the edge of Great Kneighton, and how we could build from our formal court that controlled this arrival space through a series of mews spaces, and then into these sort of fingers of landscape, these green lanes that weave their way from the plantation up into the Great Court where they're formalised. And so that's the plan of the neighbourhood. Plantation is here and the Great Court here. So images of the Great Court with the marker buildings sitting within that landscape. And then very distinctive areas within it. And I think what the point I'm trying to make here is that you don't need to just change material or change the tiling on the roofs. This is actually about the form of developments. So you get a different grain of development, and that's really what gives it character. I think the use of materials is then the added bonus, if you like. So these are some of the mews spaces, and then we base those ribbon of developments, those green lane developments, on some of the farm buildings that we see locally. There's very thin buildings with very simple roof forms. And there you see the gables forming the frontage to the streets. So it's not wide frontage houses, these are narrow gables, and they define the street edge. Have I got time for this or not?
When we do?
1 minute, okay. So I know Hassan wanted me to talk about a different kind of demographic, and this is a project for the over 55, so later living. It's on the edge of Tetbury in the Cotswolds, wonderful little market town. And again, we were looking at precedents here, historic precedents, to give a character to this particular development. And so if we went back one, you can see these farmsteads within the Cotswold landscape, very structured farms. And you can see one of them here. And so that got us thinking about the form of development for later living. And of course, there are references here as well to almshouses. So it's not only local reference to building forms, but also to some extent a generic form. The almshouse court is something that really nurtures a sense of the communal living. And that was something that we thought was very important for a later living development. And so you get a series of clusters of homes all around a court. Each court has a different landscape, a different productive landscape. And the one in the middle has a swimming pond, naturally filtered pond, with a restaurant and spas and gymnasia. And so that becomes the sort of the focus to the neighbourhood. But then you can see how the walls and this very simple structure of those farm buildings has begun to inform the architecture here. So you've got a series of Cotswold stone walls, cloistered walkways on 2 levels that define the courtyards. References to the local vernacular, this sort of twin gable motif appears in the centre of Tetbury, and that we're developing the same thing but in a contemporary way at Steepleton. And here are the gables. One of those cloistered walkways, and the textures of the local materials, of course, really help studying on through that. And I think that's probably where we should end, and let Stephen Willisey talk now. There you go.
Thank you.